Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's course content, which is on designing and focusing the interview and on qualitative interviewing. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen so we can see the PowerPoint for this week. Here we go. All right, I think we're situated. So again, the topic is designing and focusing the study and intensive interviewing. So we're going to start with some Creswell, we're going to end with some Sharmaz, and we're really going to talk about how to integrate this course material together, because what we want is full integration from our research aims to the kinds of research questions we're asking to how we design our interview guide, and the kinds of data that we collect in the field should be in alignment with what some of our studies aims are. This is not to say that in qualitative interviewing, particularly in grounded theory, we don't pursue new leads and new aims, because again, our priorities as researchers are not always the priorities of our research participants. So within this framework, we do allow for the possibility to deviate from our original research aim. So I want us to keep that in the back of our mind, but we also need to develop interview guides that facilitate that allow for open-ended conversation, so we are not boxing our research participants in and being so narrow with our aims. So this is quite, a unique skill to learn for a researcher. First, we're going to start with Creswell. So he talks about in his book the need to really develop a problem statement. So I'm going to hand out to all of you on our shared Blackboard website a problem statement worksheet, which I'd like you to complete after watching this video. And it's really short, really easy. We're going to go through it a little bit later on in the slides, but it helps us to use encoded language that signals our research approach. So remember last week we covered the 5 approaches. It allows us to introduce a purpose statement, which really situates our study within our unique participant population. It helps us focus down on the topic and then develop our central research question or questions. And then within those, we sometimes have some sub questions we'd also like to explore. So I really like this section of Creswell's reading where he gets into the reasons for a qualitative study. So in qualitative work, we often have additional justification to do within our papers and proposals as to why this does need to be a qualitative study. And he gives us some examples using encoded language and sometimes just general language that we can use to justify why we need our study and why we need it now and why this is worthy of a research approach. The first is to add to the literature where there's a literature gap. The second is to give voice to an underrepresented group. Often in qualitative work, we tend to focus our studies on participant populations experiencing marginalization, stigmatization. So the underrepresentation of that group's voice is often justification alone for conducting a qualitative study. Probing understanding of a central phenomenon is also really interesting, and that kind of goes in alignment with our special friend phenomenology. Lead to outcomes such as stories, goes along with the narrative approach, generating theory, social process, potentially generating a theoretical foothold in a new area is a way to justify grounded theory. Examining a cultural life of a group goes along with the approach of ethnography, and doing an in-depth analysis of a case is a way to justify the use of case study approach. Okay. So what we want to think about with the introduction elements, and I'm hoping that this helps you to develop your proposals, which are due on Monday, and we're going to sit down and have our Shark Tank / peer review exercise. which is going to be really exciting, is that this whole chart, I'm hoping, helps you narrow down the elements that should be in your proposal. For example, the topic should have some kind of narrative hook. So not to say that you're going to use skills that you use in narrative writing, such as nonfiction, but narrative hooks meaning generate really quick, really punchy, the central importance of your research topic. This will go into research problem, which is more of a need for the study. Then you should support this with some scholarly literature. And you don't have a time for a ton of scholarly literature when doing a one-page proposal, but it should be directly, generally, or relatively related to the study. If it is directly, that's ideal. However, some of us study topics that there is not a lot of scholarship on, and that would be maybe more relatively related to the study. So start with directly, then maybe move to generally, and then maybe relatively connected or related to your study. And this can be based on topic, this can be based on existing theory, this can be based on participant population, and really look at the intersection of those. You also make sure your study has not been done before. So that's a good time to check that out. Deficiencies. So this is another way that we can really justify our qualitative approach, or maybe even more specifically, one of the 5 approaches. So we look for inadequacies in the existing literature. And like I said, this mentions the approach. So maybe somebody has generated stories related to your project topic using a narrative approach, but maybe they haven't generated theory, and there's a need to do some of that. We then want to address audiences and stakeholders. So again, in qualitative work, we are interested in solving problems. So what problem is your research trying to solve, and who stands to benefit from that? That could be nurses, social workers, your particular participant populations. This could be training programs. This could be existing researchers. And then lastly, this funnels down to this purpose statement, which is really the overall intent of our projects. So Creswell gives this example, which I think is pretty good, pretty old, but still holds up against, the test of time. I'm going to move this around so we can all see it. So he looks at this smoking cessation study that was done with high school students. And he gives an example using this study as how to break down moving from research problem to the importance of the audience. And I think this is a really great template to learn from. So he talks about, for this particular study, that the problem is tobacco causes cancer. Really simple. The evidence from the literature says that, this is grounded in literature, this is grounded in science, but previous research has focused on these 4 topics. So he's laying out what's already been done. And then he moves into deficiencies in evidence. So because this project was done with high schoolers, they discussed there's minimal research on social context, so how the environment impacts smoking. And then all the existing studies are quantitative. So there is no qualitative, there's limited qualitative investigations, and those who don't allow high school students as co-research. So it sounds like this article was taking a more participatory approach, maybe even a YPAR approach, where they were trying to engage high schoolers as co-researchers, which hasn't been done before in this topic area. That's why it's novel. Lastly, he's talking about the importance to audiences. So understanding tobacco use in high school. So anybody involved with high schools can benefit from that: students, faculty, administrators, etc. He talks about how research tend to isolate variables. So researchers can benefit by looking more at the context, and administrators and teachers can plan interventions using this study. So think about how your study is useful. So I love this exercise and doing it with my students every year. And I always say, yay, it's a fill in the blank script, because let's face it, during PhD and even graduate study work in general, there are not enough fill in the blank exercises where we tend to have to generate everything as new. So I'd like you all for this week to just fill in the blank script. And I've posted this on Blackboard. So the next few slides, I'm going to go deeper into the different sections of this and give some examples, but I want you to think about the purpose of the statement is fill in the blank with your study approach, one of the 5 approaches. This study is to understand, describe, develop, discover. So think about linking that to the encoded language of one of the 5 approaches. The blank, which is the central phenomenon of your study. This can be meaning around skin cancer, meaning around the normalization of deviance, meaning making around fitness testing in the military, just to use a few of your examples. For X participants, so fill in your participant populations. That can be nurses, that can be women in the military, that could be outdoor laborers at such and such site. So where are your participants located? Maybe this is geographically, maybe this is within an organization. So at this stage of the research, the repeat central phenomenon will be generally defined as, and this is where I want you to develop your general definition of your concept, whether or not that's normalization of deviance or fitness testing or something that is the central concept that you are exploring. And you can do this through a combination of different things. You can look at existing literature. How is this defined in other studies? How is this defined in the dictionary? But you also have some license to adjust that based on your experience and knowledge with this participant population as well. So let's just think about that before filling this in, because often the Webster's dictionary definition of your central concept is not actually what you're trying to explore within your context of your study and your participants' lives. So what are the components of a purpose? So this is, again, going to help you fill out that purpose statement worksheet. So it helps you identify your approach, again, one of the 5 approaches. It helps you encode the focus of your approach. So remember, we've been learning a lot about the encoded language. So what language goes along with grounded theory? What language goes along with phenomenology? It helps you identify and define your terms. So what is your central phenomenon and what words do you want to use to describe your central phenomenon? It helps you foreshadow, identify participants at a site, and also gives you a general definition, or at least a starting place for general definition of your research topic, AKA the central phenomenon. Okay, so Creswell on table 6.1 gives you words to encode in your purpose statement. So again, review this when developing your purpose statement worksheet. What goes along with narrative, what goes along with phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnography, case study. Use that to help support the creation. So the way Creswell conceptualizes this is this purpose statement kind of encapsulates your entire study. It's really an umbrella, a starting place that the rest of your study will be, funneled in through. So it helps us to sort of approach this through open-ended, evolving, non-directional language. It helps us restate our purpose in very specific terms. It gives us sort of this ability to do a grand tour of our research topic that really leads us to being able to, when developing our interview guide, locate our participant population, locate our research topic within that participant population, and then give a very general introduction or acquaintance with our participants by saying, like, tell me about yourself in relationship to this topic. It also allows us to develop these overarching central questions and then several sub-questions within. So we want to think about this. We're moving on to the next stage. We have the purpose statement, and then we have the central question below. So Creswell recommends that we write as broadly as possible using these encoded 5 approaches. So what are the lived experiences of? What is the meaning of? What is the process of? What is the meaning of blank within this cultural context? And how do the events of this case inform? So this language really does link up to each of the 5 approaches. So I want you to try to use the language of these encoded approaches to think about your central research question. And really what we're thinking about is, what does it mean to be? So I'll use my research as an example. So I'm recently working on a paper that looks at the intersection of alcohol and other drug use with the HIV care continuum amongst a population of 35 older African Americans living with HIV. And so what I'm asking when I'm looking at my data, when I'm interviewing people, is what does it mean to be an older African American living with HIV who is engaging in alcohol and other drug use while trying to manage HIV care within the context of the HIV care continuum? So I know that's pretty specific to my project, but I want you to think about how you can apply that language and broad thinking to your projects as well. So within that, we want to think about some smaller sub questions, which should also be open-ended. These can begin with how or what. We tend to not use why questions at this stage, or really when qualitatively interviewing in general. These form the core collections of our question and sub-questions. So this really gets at the central question, because the central question is quite broad, but our sub-questions can narrow down to things that are quite specific. So he says 5 to 7 sub-questions. I tend to use less, maybe even 2 or 3 to really get at. So, how does alcohol and other drug use impact older African Americans' experience with the HIV care continuum? That's an example of a how question. What environmental factors create barriers to the HIV care continuum amongst this population? What role does alcohol and other drug use play in creating barriers to the HIV care continuum? So those are just some examples. I want you to practice and think about that with your own projects. Okay. Next, we're going to get into Sharmaz's chapter. So I really love how she starts this chapter with an example of a really important interviewing skill. So now we're moving on from how do we design our central questions to really how do we design our interview guide / what kind of skills do we need as empathetic researchers who are using qualitative approaches, specifically, grounded theory approaches, but I think this does map on to all sorts of qualitative interviewing in general. So she talks about the importance of an affirmative sentence. So we don't always need to pop off question after question after question in a very regimented way from our interview guide. We can actually just affirm with what somebody said, and that enables us to do 2 things. It shows the participant we're following along. It also allows us to confirm that we are understanding what they're talking about. So the example of, so you feel very selective with your time and energy, is a response from an interviewer after the participant went on a very long paragraph describing how she was really managing living with a chronic health condition. And that led to even more beautiful text and description below, because the participant knew that the interview was following along with an affirmative sentence. So when we're thinking about interviewing, the way Sharmaz conceptualizes this is that it's a gently guided, one-sided conversation that explores a person's substantial experience within a research topic, which I love that, of thinking about it as a gently guided, one-sided conversation. So when I'm reading your interview transcripts, what I'm looking for is that the participant should be talking a lot and you should be talking very little. You're more or less just sort of guiding the conversation, not driving it. You're just directing the boat slightly, but they're more in control. So she also differentiates that there are these 3 types of interviews, and then signals that we are using the intensive interviewing style, which I'll get to at the end of this slide. So informational interviewing, but she does mention that we do kind of pull from each of these approaches of interviewing. throughout a qualitative interview, because sometimes we do just need to be informational. We do need to gather accurate facts such as demographics. So if you're administering, a demographic survey / questionnaire in the beginning of your interview guide to understand sort of the demographics related to the participant that you're working with, you will need to use an informational interview style. That will not elicit the thick and rich, juicy data that you need to really conduct high quality qualitative study. However, so there's that informational style. So description of events, detailed about order, places, people involved. And sometimes when we're trying to clarify someone's story, we do need to shift back into that informational interviewing style. The second is investigative. So this involves hidden actions, exposing policies and practices and their implications. So this is mainly used in like investigative journalism. However, what Kathy Sharma says is that sometimes we do need to investigate people's stories a little more. So to get to the crux of what that meaning of that story was for them and how that informed either their meaning making around their topic or informed them how to act within their story. But we mainly want to focus on this intensive interviewing style. And this is what she said creates the interactional space in which the participant can relate their experience. I love that. So our job as qualitative researchers is to create an interactional space between us and our participants that gives way to us generating meaning. So we need to gather rich, useful data. So how do I know that I am collecting rich, useful data? What Kathy Sharma says is that we need to collect nuanced data, and we need to ask ourselves, is our participant talking about and giving us information related to meaning and related to process? So this involves a style of flexibility and control. We need to create an open space for ideas and issues to arise, but we also need to pounce in and do some immediate follow-up that involves the co-construction that she's talking about. Is that meaning in qualitative interview is co-constructed. That's part of our epistemological approach. Is that, remember from week one, Bob did not just give everything away, you went out and found it. And that's how she says you're creating that interactional space through intensive interviewing. So this also involves us being fluent or learning the language of our participant population. So this example, I'm going to follow up on in our next set of slides, which is really week 5, part 2, where we're talking about an example in page 60. And I think this is a really powerful example of how the researcher really needs to respond and act in a moment that covers many different things: language, ethics, interaction with the research participants. So make sure you read this section carefully because it's going to bring up some questions that I'm going to answer in my next talk. So the example that she gives is when somebody is doing research with participants who are incarcerated in a prison setting. And the person talks about prison, somebody who is incarcerated talking about taking out dirty inmates. So signals to the researcher that they're talking about how they know when somebody comes in and has a charge against them for being a child sex offender. And so she talks about in this example the importance of clarifying meaning and how you need to know the language, because the person's throwing around different codes, different language that might only be familiar within incarceration settings. She talks about knowing the language advances or forms of questioning and makes the participant feel at ease because they're not having to stop when they're telling their story and fill you in on every acronym, every part of the insider language. She also talks about the need for information that is grounded in data. So the questions that the researcher follows up on helps really support what they think is going on. So she says, what does that mean? What does, taking out dirty inmates mean? She says, blind spot. Like, what is a blind spot? Questioning. And then he fills in the blanks on what a blind spot means, which is really an area of the prison where there are no cameras. And then lastly, did you kill him? And he responds with, well, he wasn't moving when we were finished. So this is the part of qualitative interviewing where I want you to think about your transcript as being suspended from the actual experience that you have with your participant, because you want to think about, sometimes you have to confirm what your participants are saying rather than make assumptions. Because when you're left with that transcript at the end of the day, if something is not confirmed, it doesn't exist. We can't say that, we just assumed that X, Y, and Z happened if our participant doesn't confirm that on the transcript. So in many ways, sometimes this turns into strategies that lawyers use in depositions, where they sometimes ask you to, confirm what they're talking about rather than, making a gesture. So I want you to consider that without having this guide your interviewing practice, but knowing that sometimes you might need to engage in some of that confirming language to clarify meaning. And we're going to get to some of the ethical issues related to this example during my next presentation. So I think this is very important, and Kathy Sharmaz talks about the status of the researcher. So when I'm interviewing a participant, it's often a participant with vastly different life experiences and characteristics than myself. So I have to be mindful of the fact that I bring in the fact that I'm a white woman with a middle-class background that has a PhD, and I can't change that. I bring all of that into the interview space with me, and that needs to be accounted for because that can directly impact the interaction that I have with my participants. So we need to consider how we appear to gatekeepers and prospective participants. I often find that students have very great luck in connecting to research participants, and I would be very upfront about your status as a student because I think it tends to benefit students because participants often like to lend a helping hand to students. As a rule of thumb, you want to look compatible to the world of the people that you want to interview. So later on the chapter, Kathy Sharmaz talks about interviewing elites. So maybe business people with high economic status within an organization. You want to fit into the culture of that organization. So you would really marry your dress and appearance to that. I've done studies with populations experiencing homelessness, and I'm not going to wear, a suit and high heels out to meet somebody at a location they've decided on. If that is the case for that interview, I'm going to try to match my style of dress and clothing and interaction to reflect the environment and the participant population that I'm working with. Kathy Sharmaz makes a really good point that there is a huge problem with consent forms, even though they're critically necessary to what we do in research. They often do damage because when reading out a consent form to a participant that we are trying to recruit to be a part of our study, it really puts us at a position of being legal adversaries with our participants rather than joining in with them as partners in the research process. I think that's becoming a little better with the openness that the IRB is having lately to doing a preamble consent, because then it's more of a verbal interaction rather than reading out all this legal paperwork. But Kathy Sharmaz says to make time in your interview process to do some interactional work that can help to undo the damage that the consent and the recorder can often cause in the interview space. Also practice. What are you going to say to somebody when you introduce the recording device, when you introduce the when you introduce the informed consent form? Really practice that in role play, with a fellow student, with a loved one, with a family member, friend, because you will not regret having just that experience running through some of these things and the logistics, because you really do have to set up quite a bit before jumping into your interview guide questions. Which brings us to constructing the interview guide. She talks about some of these things with IRB issues. So one of the things that comes to mind is that, Kathy Sharmas is very open-ended and evolving and iterative with her interview approach. Yet our interview guide, or what sometimes people call a semi-structured questionnaire, needs to be approved by our IRB. So I'm very explicit in my IRB that this is just an interview guide, meaning that I'm not going to follow it to a T, question 1, question 2, question 3, but that I'm going to try to create that interactional space where we can go off on tangents, where we can go down a line of thinking or a pathway of thinking or a story that doesn't quite relate to my research question, but is meaningful and examines the research participants' priorities in relationship to my research question. So this requires constant reflexivity and analysis of questions and asking ourselves, did I force the data? Did I force the data, or was this actually occurring in the field? A second thing to think about is, she says, when constructing our interview guide, is the absence of why questions. So we do not want to ask why questions. And the reason for that is because asking why questions definitely puts like an interrogation spin on some of our questions. So instead of asking, well, why did you do that? What events led up to you making that decision or taking that action? It just creates less of a defensive tone in our questions. This allows us to explore and not interrogate our participants. So symbolic interactionism has an emphasis on learning about participants' views, experienced events, and actions. So we want to create our interview guide using this type of format. So box 3.1 in Sharmas's chapter 3 gives us an example of all sorts of interview questions that you can use. And what I'd like you to do, for those of you who are still constructing your interview guide, I would like you to try to plug in your research topic into as many of those questions as you can, because those questions are deliberately designed to get at meaning and action, rooted in symbolic interactionism and pragmatism. You also want to think about how to ease into asking some of our difficult, more sensitive questions. So I'll give you an example. I did my dissertation in Vietnam on grandparents who are raising grandchildren due to the HIV epidemic in their country, in Vietnam. And as a cultural outsider, I had to be really careful about easing in to some of these questions. So what I really wanted to know is, how did you become the caregiver for your grandchildren? But what I started my interview guide with was, tell me about your family. So you can see the difference between those two questions, is that if somebody is given space to tell me all sorts of things that they want me to know about their family, before asking, how did you become the grandparent caregiver to these grandchildren? And that would lead into conversations about how their adult age child had died due to AIDS-related illness, but I couldn't really start from there. So we have to be careful about how we're trying to craft our interview guide, and I'm happy to take a look at any of your interview guide questions ahead of time. So Kathy Sharmas also talks about how conducting an interview is a privilege. So we need to know a certain amount of information about our population before, moving into the field completely blank. So ideally, we would have some familiarity, maybe some professional connections, maybe some volunteer time, maybe spending time on the board, maybe talking with social workers, nurses, public health professionals that work with this population before, easing in. We also want to think about how we are going to ask difficult, challenging questions that have to do with sensitive subject matters within the interview space spontaneously as a story comes up. So she also gives us a really great list of questions that we can practice. So let's say I'm wanting to ask more questions about somebody's adult child dying due to AIDS-related illness. I might say, I don't know if this is appropriate question to ask, but, or I feel like maybe all these questions are too personal. You can ask me to stop at any time. Or can I ask you, may I have permission to ask you a more personal question? I also like to relate this back to what others have said, because that way you're joining the voice of the participant you're working with to really the chorus of others. And so you can say, you know, others have told me that they felt this emotion when that difficult thing happened to them. What do you think about that? Or would you tell me how to define it so that I have it in your own words? That's a really powerful question to ask to generate meaning making. But the position and the stance we are taking in all of these interviewing questions is that the participant is the expert, and we are here to learn from them as the expert. We're being taught about their significant experiences and how to interpret them. And sometimes that forces us to be wrong in the interview. And I just want to say that there is some power in being wrong. We don't want to consistently get things wrong so that the interview participant feels maybe alienated, feels like we don't understand them. But there are times when we are, you know, testing out and confirming data and we have gotten it wrong. And then if a participant corrects you and says, no, that's actually not what I meant about that story, that actually gives you really great insight into meaning making within their own terms and gives you probably a really powerful excerpt of data to work with. So negotiations in the interview is the next topic she focuses on. So she says we really need to think about the dynamics of power at all phases of the interview. We need to think about professional status, gender, race, age, and how that will affect the direction and the content of the interview. She mentions that there's sometimes challenges in interviewing what she calls elites. So these are people that we're often interviewing within their professional role who are in high power positions. This might be business people, administrators, politicians. There is a danger of rhetoric because sometimes they are towing the company line, using the company jargon. And so what I find when doing that, whenever interviewing administrators of social service organizations in my field, it's often that I ask them if they use a line of rhetoric or if they use a word involving rhetoric, I'll often say, what does that mean to you? To try to get at that deeper meaning related to that language. New challenges come up when interviewing participants who have been marginalized, maybe from participant groups that have experienced stigma. And often this comes up with interviewing youth, is that people who have experienced a crisis may seek direction from their interviewer. So an example when I was going through my PhD is that I was reading another classmate's transcripts who was interviewing youth and who were incarcerated. And in the middle of the interview, one of the youth said to him, what do you're studying to become a doctor. What do you think is wrong with me? And we had to think about this and process this in class really hard to think about, well, what would be an appropriate response from an interviewer who is a researcher in that moment? This child is asking for help, yet we're not exactly in the role of being that person's social worker. In fact, we're not in the role. We are in the role of a social scientist. So usually I like to explore that in class and have you think about that for a little bit. But what I tend to land on with my students is that that is typically a great time to ask your participant a question, which is, I'm really here to learn from you as the expert. In your words, what do you think is wrong? And try to explore some of their assumptions behind the question that they're asking and some of their hypotheses as to what potentially have led them to this situation in their life. But again, there's always new, interesting challenging ethical issues that come up in the field all the time. So Kathy Sharmaz then goes on to critique interviewing and kind of moves in a direction where she's saying we also should supplement interviews with additional data if possible. So for example, documents or participant observation, because she says what people may say may not be what they do, have done, or would do in the future. So something to keep in mind. And I always love to complement my interviews with some kind of participant observation to see how what one is saying is sort of adding up to what one is really doing. She also talks about the significance of silences. So she says to critically examine silences almost like a puzzle. So sometimes in interviewing and reading transcripts, the power of silences is quite important. So what are people willing to talk about and what are people not willing to talk about? And what people are not willing to talk about is what Kathy Sharmaz refers to as a silence. And even if the interview goes terribly wrong, we really can't connect to the participant, they really don't want to talk to us, we can still gather some valuable interview/research data by asking ourselves the question, what is happening in this interview? So again, what is happening? What led to this going wrong? What is this person trying to protect? Where did the connection break? And so what is happening here in the research data and the interview data in that international space? So I want you to think about some activities you can do at home as you are preparing for your first interview. So we have to be able to enter the field with some knowledge about our scholarship. So we want to research as much and read as much as we can about our topic and our participant population. We need to try to be conversant in the language of our participant population in our area. We need to gain the tools to conduct interviews that involve specialized knowledge or technical sophistication. So I use an example here is a few years back, I was doing a study on the impact of the Affordable Care Act on substance use disorder treatment centers in LA County. And it really had to do about the integration and coordination of care of substance use disorder treatment and mental health. It was very technical. It had to do a lot about policy. It had a lot to do about billing for services within these organizations. And I really had to do a lot of studying to onboard myself when talking to clinical supervisors about how this policy was playing out at their organization and what billing codes were being used and what acronyms were being used. And it took a lot of work, but it paid off because in the interview space, I was able to be conversant and interact with my participant population in a way that generated meaning and action. We want to practice interviews, which can help avert mistakes later on. So we want to practice bringing up sensitive topics. We might want to ask informants or key informants about how to bring up these topics or peers that might work in the field as well. And last slide of the day, I want to encourage all of you to do what I call LARPing. So if we were in class live, I'd probably break you off into partner groups and have you just practice your interview guide with your partner role playing your participant population. And even though this isn't a completely accurate, pilot study, it does give us a chance to speak out loud our questions and see which ones land and which ones might need to be refined, or potentially defined. So maybe some of our terms need to be defined more for our participant population as well. So that is my final slide for today. I'm going to stop sharing, and I hope that you all learned a lot about how to design and focus our study using our purpose statement, how to form central questions and sub-questions, and how that really maps on to the development of an interview guide. So I'm going to post our purpose statement worksheet on our course Blackboard site, and that way you can practice filling that out before class next week. So I hope all of you are doing well, and I'm excited to see you again soon. Thank you all. Bye.